But just to kind of start out, talking about our world of pollinators. So this is a garden in the city of Poughkeepsie, and as you first look, when you look at flowers, like, oh wow, those are really beautiful. Look at all the beautiful flowers. But I hope today, after you leave here, that you start looking closer at these flowers, because the flowers have a lot of visitors, and we're going to focus in on those today. So here on this cone flower, we have a long-horned bee, and we'll talk a little bit more about these. This is actually a male bee, and through this program, I'll teach you how you know that that is a longhorn bee, or why that's a male. And longhorn referring to his long antenna. Look at another flower. This is echinacea, this is coneflower, and this is a fritillary butterfly. So pollinators are not just bees, but there's a whole variety of pollinators out there in our world. Wasps, there's a lot of wasps out there. You guys were talking a little bit about wasps and things. And yeah, wasps are really cool, and they're also pollinators as well. And a lot of wasps get a lot of bad rap. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some stuff we've learned about wasps. And I don't know, are you all familiar with the spotted lanternfly?
Oh yeah, I saw them.
So, yep, it's a new invasive species in our area. Yep, so spotted lanternfly are an invasive species, and we're learning now that our native wasps are actually learn how to eat them. They actually eat other insects. And of course, bumblebee, and you see the bumblebee on this mint, and also Liatris, we see a painted lady butterfly. So I'm going to kind of move on here. The importance of our bees: 1 in every 3 bites of food that you eat is to thank a pollinator. So when you're eating an apple, that's a pollinator. If you're drinking coffee, that all of our plants that come from pollinators. So, and we look at $29 billion of income comes from pollinators. 58 crops are directly or indirectly associated with insects and their pollination. And the interesting thing is, you might think maybe the Adirondacks has a lot more variety of bees. I'll reveal to you today a rare bee that actually has been found to be in high populations here in the New York City, Hudson Valley, Westchester area. So Bombus fervidus, the yellow bumblebee. Pollinator syndrome. So bees, different types of insects are attracted to different types of things. So charts are kind of boring. So let me ask you if you can think of any types of pollinators. Raise your hand if you can think of a type of pollinator. Yes, sir. What might be a type of pollinator? Other than a bee. Other than a bee. And anybody here can, yes. A wasp, that's right. So in my pile of things here, I have wasps. And also beetles are pollinators. Did you know that beetles were the...
I was going to say some beetles pollinate.
Yep, yeah, they do. And beetles were the world's first pollinators. Flowering plants are called angiosperms. So they're the first flowering plants to be in the world. And so beetles existed a long time before bees existed. And so these were some of our first pollinators. And they are attracted to, and when we go back and we take a look, beetles. Beetles are attracted to dull white or green flowers. They don't have a lot of smell, and their magnolia is going to be one of the things that they do. And they don't necessarily need the nectar. They're actually looking for the pollen. Here's another big pollinator, flies. Flies are a very common pollinator, and oftentimes flies actually look like bees. And so it's called Bastian mimicry. And here we have a fly that looks a lot like a bee. And there's all different kinds of flies that look like, it does look like a honeybee. It's black and yellow. And so flies are really good pollinators. And they're after a lot of pollen when they visit the flowers. Birds. Birds are pollinators. So you all seen hummingbirds?
I see hummingbirds.
Yeah. What color do you think hummingbirds like? You can see it in that flower right there. Yep. What color do they like? You want to say? Yes, go ahead.
Hot orange pink?
Yeah, they like bright red. So a flower that's actually red is probably going to be attracting something other than a bee. And I'll get to that in just a minute. So butterflies and moths are other big pollinators. And this is a moth right here. This is a hummingbird moth or a clear wing moth. And they are out in the daytime. So a lot of times you think moths come out at night and are attracted to lights. The moths you see at night actually don't feed in their adult stage. But here we have a moth that's feeding in the daytime. Here, and again, we have back to our wasp. And we're going to dive into some kind of wasps sting people. Some kind don't sting people. Same with bees. Some sting people, some don't. And today we're going to learn a little bit about that. But we're going to deep dive into bees today. Yes?
When I was at a place that I was feeding a bee and the bee didn't sting me.
Nope. And they won't often sting you when they're actually out pollinating.
Are yellow bees, do yellow bees like fish and chips? What is it like? Do they like meat? Because
Wasps like meat.
I know.
So, but bees don't. Bees are actually vegetarian. So I'm going to do a little thing here. You're going to tell me bees can see in a different color spectrum than you and I can. So do you think bees can see purple?
No.
Nope, they can. They can see purple. Oops. Do you think bees can see yellow?
Yes.
Yes, bees can see yellow. Can bees see blue?
No.
They,
Yeah.
Yep, they can see blue.
What?
Can bees see green?
Yeah.
Yes, they can. How about orange?
Yeah.
Yep, they can see orange. What about red?
Definitely red.
They can't see red. That's the interesting thing. They actually can't see red, but they can see an ultraviolet. And ultraviolet is just past the color of purple on the spectrum. And so, as we look at the bees view world. So when you can't see red and you can see an ultraviolet, a lot of flowers actually have ultraviolet markers that lead the bees to the nectar in the flower, to the nectar in the pollen. So they lead them right down to where all the nectar is so that they can kind of eat that. And you can see the shift here. This is the ultraviolet color that you and I can't see. There's different types of birds that can see ultraviolet, but bees can't. So a dandelion looks a lot different really to a bee, right? When you add the ultraviolet, it kind of leads them down to where they'll find that sweet, yummy nectar that the bees like. Bees are designed for pollination. So you remember that beetle. That beetle was very different from this bee. So as time went by, bees are actually descendant from wasps. And over time, they started becoming vegetarian, eating pollen and eating nectar. So let's look at this bee right here. And we can take this bee as an example right here. What do you notice about that bee? It has lots of hair on it, right? Yep. That's a bumblebee, you're right. And the way we know it's a bumblebee, number one, bees are almost always fuzzy. And I say that, but in nature always has exceptions to every rule, right? So though bees are almost always fuzzy, they're not all always fuzzy. And we'll talk about that a little later today too. But most bees are fuzzy because as they're visiting the flowers, all of that hair, they'll get pollen all over them. And if you watch them, they'll actually groom themselves. And they're going to be putting the pollen into a special place on their body. That's a pollen basket, and they're going to put the pollen in their basket and carry it back to their hive. And the reason I want to point this out, because as we start talking about our native bees and all the different species of bees that are out there, I want you to notice that because that's very key to our bees. Not all the bees have pollen baskets. Some have different ways of bringing that pollen back to their hive or to their nest. Wings. Bees have clear wings, and they're called hymenoptera, clear wings. Hymenoptera, it means clear wings. And so they have clear wings, and they have two sets of wings. Two sets of wings on each side. Flies only have two wings. So remember we saw the fly that looked a lot like the bee? We're going to learn also how to tell the difference between flies and bees today. Also, what do you see down on the bottom there? What do bees sometimes have? A stinger. That's right. So a lot of bees will have stingers. Only female bees have the stinger because the stinger is an adaptation of the ovipositor, which is where they lay their eggs, how they lay their eggs. So no male bees will sting you because they don't have stingers. So sometimes when we think of a carpenter bee, they'll kind of like dive bomb you. The males are very territorial, and you and I all think that bees all sting. So they kind of use that to their advantage to scare people away, but they don't sting. Males don't sting. And most female bees and our native bees won't sting either, and we'll learn about why that might be too. Look at that long, what do you notice right here? It's a long what? Yes. Or their tongue. We can just call it their tongue, right? Yeah, it's like a straw, and the proboscis. And it's like a straw, so it sips up nectar. Bees have sucking mouth parts for drinking and chewing mouth parts. And we'll learn about how they use those chewing mouth parts too. There's certain kinds of bees that use those chewing mouth. So that's a little bit about what makes a bee and a unique pollinator specially suited to visiting flowers. And over time, different flowers evolve with different types of bees as well. But now, let's focus on our native bees. I call them native pollen bees because they are out collecting pollen, and they actually don't make honey. There are 4,000 species of bees in North America. And look at that. You see how that bee has a very long tongue? Some bees have long tongues, some have short tongues. And that is how they decide. There's different kind of flowers that they do. So a long-tongued bee is going to be very attracted to this flower that has a long entrance to get the nectar. So long-tongued bees have an association with different types of plants. There's 450 bees in New York State. 6 of the 7 bee families are represented. Now, when we think of bees, what do we usually think of? We think of what when we think of bees? What type of bee? Honeybees. Honeybees. Everybody loves honeybees. Honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought here in the year 1622. So before that, there was no honeybees in North America, so the Native Americans actually did not eat honey. They would have, for a sweetener, here in the Northeast anyways, they would have used maple syrup for a sweetener. But in the geological record in Nevada, they found the fossil remnants of a honeybee. Apis neartica was found. So a long time ago, there was a species of honeybee in North America that went extinct a very long time ago. Another animal that evolved here in North America, too, was actually the horse. They went extinct in North America, but continued to evolve on the other side of the world. So 30% of our bees are what we call specialists. That means they only visit a certain kind of flower, all right? So they're specialists. For example, right there you see a squash bee. So who here has a garden at home? Okay, so if you go to your garden, into the squash flowers when they're in bloom in the summertime, and you look in there, you might have this bee looking back at you. It's called a squash bee, and they are very unique in the fact that they will actually nest right in your garden, and they actually nest in the ground, right in your garden, and they actually have deep holes that nest in the ground. In a minute, we're going to talk about the life cycles of those bees, but all the bees that you see here are all specialists. 30% of bees are specialists. They specialize on certain kinds of flowers. The rest of the bees are what we call generalist bees. That means they'll go visit any kind of flower, and they don't have a particular preference of one kind over another. These are the bees that, so of the generalist or the specialist, which ones do you think are having, when we think of bees providing habitat for bees, which ones do you think are more threatened? Specialist bees or generalist bees? No, the generalists will eat anything. So the generalists, they don't have to pick a certain kind of flower. So it's the specialist bees we really need to be concerned about. 30% of bees are stem nesters. What does that mean? That means they nest inside of a hollow tube. So they nest inside a hollow tube. These are our native bees, 30%. So these bees have no queens. So they don't have a hive in the traditional sense of a hive. So they have no queen. Every female is an egg layer. All right? Every female bee is an egg layer. This is a blue orchard bee here, and she's nesting in something similar to what I have here. So in the wild, in nature, holes get inside of trees due to grubs and different things, and so they'll use holes that are in trees, or they'll use stems like like blackberries, stems, or different types of reed grasses. So they'll nest in those. So actually bramble bushes, if you like blackberries and raspberries, or sumac that grows on the side of the road, they have hollow stems. All of those are used by our native bees as homes to lay their eggs. 70% of the bees live under the ground. So instead of living in a hollow stem or a hollow tube, they're going to actually live under the ground. Now, how does this all kind of work? So let's start off with the blue orchard bee. Let me go back to our blue orchard. So you see that bee right there? So she has found a hole or a hollow stem, which in this case is Phragmites stem that I've put into a nest box, or it could be like a paper straw. So she wakes up in the springtime and she starts collecting pollen and nectar, and she starts bringing it back. So she will come into this hollow tube and she'll go to the very back. And what she brings back is nectar and pollen. And she mixes it together in something called bee bread. And she puts it in there and she lays an egg. And these are also known as, so she's a blue orchard bee and mason bees. So they're using mud. So she'll create a mud wall. Then she goes and gets some more bee bread, puts it in there, lays an egg in bee bread, and then she makes another mud wall. And this goes on all the way till she gets to the end of the tube. It's very important that for the different size bees that you have a right length and right size. So the smaller the bee, the less. For a mason bee right here, she's going to want a 6-inch long tube. And in the back, where do you think she puts the males? She knows whether to lay a female egg or a male egg. Where does she lay the male eggs? In the front or in the back?
In the back.
Yep. Well, anybody else have another idea? Front or the back?
The back.
Now remember, your females are egg layers, and they're very, very important. So she's going to protect the females, you're right, by putting them in the back. So she puts all the females in the back and the males in the front. So if along comes fall and the birds are really hungry, they eat one male out of here. So what? We lost a male. Ate a second male. They can't reach the third or fourth male, maybe. And so we don't need as many males. We want more females. So she protects the females by putting them in the back part of the nest. And so the males will emerge first in the springtime, and then the females will emerge after that. So that's an interesting fact about bees and how they kind of lay their eggs. Now, if I'm a ground nesting bee, the same thing's going to happen, but it's going to happen underground. The 70% that live underground. So the same thing, they have a life cycle. Some of the bees are very seasonal, like the blue orchard bee, you only see in the early part of spring. And after she lays her eggs, the female will die, the males will die, and then they start going through. She lays the egg, and what happens to the egg? She lays the egg, and what's the first thing that happens to an egg? Think of a chicken. What happens? It has to do what? The chicken sits on it, and after 21 days, what happens? The egg what? Cracks. It hatches. So the egg hatches, and then it's a larva, and then these go through complete metamorphosis. So then you have a larva, and the larva goes into a pupa. So a larva looks like a little grub or a little worm, and then it goes into a pupa. And this is an interesting thing about butterflies do this, bees do this, complete metamorphosis. In their cocoon, their body literally melts and is put back together again. So you completely change from one form to another form. And so they literally turn into this white goo, and the body reassembles itself into the adult version, and then it breaks out of the cocoon. And so the next spring, out comes the males, out comes the females, and the life cycle continues round and round like that. Some bees will have multiple families throughout a season. Some will only have a single generation each season. So that's important, because as we look at some different species of bees, we'll kind of know that. Now, here's the life cycle of our social bee. All of the bees that we have here in New York State of our native bees, only the bumblebee is a social bee. So what does a social bee do? The social bee has a queen. So social bees have a queen. So honeybees, they have a queen, And bumblebees have a queen. So right now, all the queen bumblebees are looking for a place to spend the winter. So they're going around looking for a place to hibernate. So the females have gotten really fat on all of the nectar and pollen over the course of the fall. And then they go into a stone wall or some dry place, and they're going to go to sleep until the spring. And when the spring comes, they wake up, and they're going to start flying around. So every bumblebee that you see in the spring is a queen. They're all queens until about the time the apple trees blossom. And if you watch these queen bumblebees, they're looking, not only collecting food for sustenance, but they're looking for here and there. What are they looking for? They just left their winter place. What's their first job they're going to have to do?
My grandson saw a queen bee in a crack, and there's lots of garbies, and there was also
Well, she doesn't have any garbies right now. She's all alone. So what's our first thing she has to do? She has to find a home. So she's looking for an empty place, an empty cavity, and this is a bumblebee box. 1 in 4 of these will typically get a bumblebee nest in them. They might nest under the ground. They might nest in anywhere where a mouse might have lived. In fact, it is said that queen bumblebees love old used mouse nests. It's a perfect place for them to build a house. So they go in. Then they start creating these little cups, because she actually can make these little wax cups that she does. And she'll actually make a little bit of honey as well. But they don't survive the winter or have their babies survive the winter. Honeybees, does anyone know why honeybees make honey? Because what's different about honeybees versus bumblebees?
When honeybees are bees that aren't like bumblebees, because honeybees collect pollen for the winter.
Yep. Well, you're right. They make the honey for the winter time. So they, unlike the queen, only the queen's going to live over the winter, right? So none of her workers, none of her drones, none of them are going to live through the winter. So the honeybees, actually the whole colony survives. And so they spend the winter going up and down the honeycombs, eating honey as the winter goes on, keeping the queen warm in the center by vibrating their wings. So when you look at the social structure of bees, you have solitary bees, then you have social bees, and then of the social bees, you have bumblebees, and then at the very end of that, most kind of evolved would be the honeybee, because they actually survive the winter with a whole colony of bees, 30 or 40,000 bees over the winter. So first she finds a place to start her nest, and so she is going to lay the first eggs, and then she has to take care of them until the worker bees start hatching, and as they hatch, they start collecting pollen, and then she doesn't have to do as much work anymore. So that's the life cycle of our social bees, and we talked a little bit about our solitary bees. So the difference between social, only the queen lays eggs. So who do you think would be more likely to sting you? A queen bumblebee or a female solitary bee? Yep. No, because she doesn't have anything to protect, right? So she's a female, so every female is an egg layer. So every female lays, so it's a social because she has a colony that she's protecting. So they might sting if you got near a nest. And that's important because everything I say about bees is also the same for wasps as well. So there are social wasps and solitary. Can anyone think of a social wasp? They're going to build a nest. There's going to be a queen, and you see them hanging in the trees. Anyone know what those are? Yep. They look like a big paper nest. Yes, bald-faced hornets. Bald-faced hornets, and they're very aggressive because they are protecting that nest. And then you have yellow jackets as well. Yellow jackets are going to be very protective as well.
I like yellow jackets.
Yep.
Some yellow jackets don't sting that much.
Now, this was the interesting thing. So the spotted lanternfly, this is research that just kind of came out. So the spotted lanternfly is an invasive species. It's causing a lot of havoc and damage to a lot of our native plants. And it turns out that the bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets have learned that they're a great food source, and then have started to eat them.
Yeah, I've seen that now. I see like I literally see them fighting them and eating
Really? You've seen that? Yeah.
I was shocked at first.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God.
And that's really good because that's very quick for nature, like the native flora and fauna, to adapt. Because at first they wouldn't eat them because they had red on them, and red is like a warning color. So that's a good sign.
I was shocked.
Yeah.
They can't see red.
Eating a dead rat.
But they can't see red, right? So that's another good point too. So, because a lot of times, like birds won't eat like monarch butterflies because they're orange. But you're right. So they don't see the red. So that's probably why I bet you birds don't eat them, but the yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets do. They also have good memory too, bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets. So if you make them mad, don't ever go near them again because they have facial recognition. They'll remember exactly what you look like. So I had a staff member once. She was from England and she had red hair, and she took a picture of a bald-faced hornet one day, and it stung her in the eye. For some reason, it made her very mad. So the next day, she came back to work, and it would only sting people with red hair. Nobody else. So the next day, she got stung in the other eye. She actually ended up swelling up, had to go to the hospital. So I kept her away from, but this was near the pig pen, and anytime she would go near there, and anybody else from the camp who had red hair, they would all of a sudden be around, and they kind of like being very aggressive towards them. But anybody else, they didn't bother at all. So I had to, luckily it was the end of summer, and they don't live through the winter, so that was a good thing. We talked a lot about bee stings right here, but the one thing I want to point out on this slide is who did I say does not sting? And this is one of them. This is a carpenter bee, male or female. It's on my finger, so I know it won't sting me. So.
I saw a carpenter bee before and
Yep.
it didn't sting me.
Nope. In fact, if he has a white patch on your face, you know it's a male, and the male won't sting you.
It couldn't fly.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
it
yeah.
didn't sting me.
A lot of times, too, sometimes they don't fly because when they're at the end of their life cycle, their wings get worn out, and that could be one of the reasons he didn't fly.
That one only had like...
But what they'll do is kind of like dive bomb you and kind of go crazy because they're very territorial, the male bees. And they could knock other bees out of the air, so it is a good defense mechanism. But females will only sting if they're trapped, and of all of our native bees, there's been no evidence and no case of anybody going into anaphylactic shock from solitary bees. So the females can sting, but they don't have as much venom in them as, say, a honeybee does. So let's just take a look at a few of our native bees. This is a mining bee right here. Mining bees are one of the first bees that you're going to see in the springtime. Now, based upon some of the stuff that I taught you a little bit earlier, we can see where she's collecting her pollen. So here she's collecting her pollen on her hind leg. She doesn't have a pollen basket. So she's not shoving it into her pollen. She's just holding it loosely on her hind leg right there. And she is a mining bee. So, do you think she lives underground, or do you think she lives in a hole? Because the answer is in the name of the bee. Yes. She live underground or in a hollow stem? Mining. What do miners do? Where do they mine?
In a hole.
In a hole, right? So they live underground, mining bees. This is a very big family of bees. There's 400 species in North America. And what I like to talk about when I'm talking to people about bees is these small little bees. Your backyard can be their whole universe, their whole world. They are going to live in your area. So if you plant flowers for these bees, and we all start planting flowers, we create a pathway. And there's something called, raise your hand if anyone's heard of pollinator pathways here in the Hudson Valley. So a lot of communities are planting flowers so that the bees can kind of travel along these pollinator pathways, because the bees only fly 500 yards. So it's a very small distance to fly. Here is a spring beauty mining bee. Now, this bee, all these are my photographs, so I go around and I follow bees around. And this one I was very lucky on a particular day because I saw her on this flower, the spring beauty. This is over at Vassar College. And I followed her, and she came back and she sat on this leaf. And then she sat there for a few minutes. Notice her pollen baskets are full, mining bee. So she went to this leaf and she went underground and then waited about 5 minutes, and she emerged with no pollen on her leg. So she went in there, she laid her egg, she made her bee bread, and she deposited it all inside there. And then she went back pollinating again. So that's a spring beauty. So that was kind of a rare treat to actually find the hole where she was and all of that kind of thing. So those are mining bees, a very big group of bees. There are spring mining bees and there are fall mining bees, but they only have a single generation in a season. Another really cool bee is a cellophane bee. Now this is in the city of Kingston on a tomatilla flower, and this particular species of colete, cellophane bee, they are specialists. So they're only going to visit certain kinds of flowers, in this case, plants in the tomatilla family or in the nightshade family. So any of the flowers in the nightshade family, they're only going to visit those. There's a lot of native nightshades here in North America, and tomatillas and tomatoes are all native to North America. They're a little bit bigger, so they can fly up to a mile in area, and there's 100 species of these. A lot of times, you will see the males all hanging out together because the females, they live underground, and so the males have no place to go. So they'll just kind of hang out on flowers and things like that. That's cellophane bees. Cellophane bees are really cool because if you ever heard of biomimicry, these bees actually can nest in wet ground. So they will build basically a plastic bag in their underground chambers that make them waterproof. Instead of doing bee bread, they actually use this liquid pollen mixture that they give the eggs. So they'll put this liquid food, and then they'll lay their egg, and then they seal it over with a layer of cellophane. So scientists are looking at this as a natural plastic. If they could figure out how these bees do this, it's called biomimicry. When we look at nature and we create something to mimic nature, it's called biomimicry. And imagine if we could create a plastic bag the way these bees create a plastic bag. It would be biodegradable. And this will last about 5 years. Their cellophane material will last about 5 years in nature. So that's a really cool thing. Here's cellophane. This is at Stony Farm. So after we plowed up the fields, they live in large aggregations, and this is really important because a lot of people will call people to spray the bees because they'll see like a big area like on their lawns, and there'll be bees all over the place, and people think bees sting, so they're afraid of them. But these bees live in what's called a large aggregation, so they live in large colonies, and they'll be all over the place. At Stony Kill, we didn't notice them at all until we plowed the field. So they're probably there for generations and generations. But it was just hay fields. So they were going in the hay and nobody noticed them. The minute we plowed the field, you could see them all working. It was probably an acre, acre and a half, or 2 acres of bees. And they all emerge in the springtime. And this particular Coletes thoracis comes out at the time the tulip poplar blooms, and they actually visit tulip poplars. They're not true specialists because they'll visit other flowers, but they do love tulip poplar, and they emerge just as the tulip poplar comes. So if you see a lot of bees like this, you can educate people like they're not dangerous. They're not going to sting you. I sat in the middle of this large 2-acre thing of bees taking pictures, and I don't get stung, right? Because remember, they're solitary bees. There's no one queen, no one hive to protect. So really cool, this bee right here. So we have some at Sharpe as well. Related to them too is this one called a yellow-faced bee. But this is different than what I told you about bees. I told you nature has exceptions to every rule. What's different about this bee than what I told you about bees? Bees are almost always what? Fuzzy, right? Is that bee fuzzy? That bee's not fuzzy. It has no hair. My first thought is, that's a wasp. That's a type of solitary wasp. But no, it's an actual bee. So instead of collecting pollen on the outside of its body, it eats it and puts it inside of its stomach. And it'll regurgitate it. And why is that important? Because it's also in the same family, Hylaeus, that we saw the coletes in, and it has liquid food that it feeds its young. Now look at this. You're such a tiny little bee that you're on the edge of a rose and you look down. Look how steep it is. He's probably thinking to himself, do I jump or do I fly? Do I jump or do I fly? What would you do? Would you fly or jump?
Out.
You'd fly. I'd fly too. Yeah, 130 species of these little bees. And you'll see them on they're small bees, so they're going to be attracted to small flowers. This is called the angelica flower here. And so they also love goldenrods. And these bees have multiple generations throughout the year. So you'll see them in the spring on angelica. You'll see them in the fall on goldenrod. Now here's a bee called sweat bees. Now so bees can be very beautiful. So here you have like a metallic green bee, which is really beautiful. It's female. She's collecting pollen on the back side of her leg. And look at those eyes. They look like marbles, don't they, with like the little eyes there. So these bees are very common, but they're attracted to people, sweat bees, because on your sweat, they like the salt. So they're going to come to you and land on you. Are they going to sting you? No, they just want the salt on you. So you can just like shoo them off and walk away from them. So these are sweat bees. There's 43 species of these in North America, and it's in a genus called Agapostemon. So they have a very small radius in which they fly. So and as we look at here's another example of a species in that area, totally green and metallic. And so they're really a beautiful bee, 122 species of these as well. So you can imagine now, like there's a lot of bees out there, and I'm not even noticing them. I didn't notice them until I started noticing them. And once you see something, you can't unsee it anymore. And then you start realizing they're everywhere, which is real good. And so if you have green metallic sweat bees, there's also dark sweat bees. And these are just another group of these, but there's only 10 species in North America. This is very common bee. Actually, you can almost see them on any given flower. They're generalists, so they're going to visit any type of flower. And then there's small sweat bees as well. These are some of the tiniest ones. When you think of like a carpenter bee versus one of these you can barely see. Now I have to wear glasses for a lot of things, so I'm taking pictures of things I can't even see until I blow them up on my computer screen. So this is on a golden Alexander, which is a tiny little flower. So mason bees, we talked about the mason bee here, but one thing I talked to you about here, look at her wings. They're all tattered. So the bees actually fly until their wings become tattered. Toward the end of their life cycle, they can really no longer fly. So they'll just kind of live out the remainder of their days. 150 species of this type of bee. This is interesting about these. So we talked about bees collecting on their legs. She actually collects pollen on her abdomen. There's scopi hair here. So she puts it on kind of her belly is where she puts the pollen. That's where she scrapes it and puts it. So we see all different places. So we have bees that have pollen on their hind legs. Some have them in pollen baskets. Some have it on the scopi hair, on their abdomens. And some eat the pollen internally and spit it up. Leafcutter bees. Sometimes people don't like leafcutter bees. I told you bees have tongues for drinking, and they also have teeth for chewing. So when we think of bees that chew, leafcutter bee, so they'll live in a stem like we talked about. Yep.
Last week, Cascade was showing you that there are leafcutter bees, and leafcutter bees like cut leaves up and use a spit to stick it together.
Exactly. They're really cool kind of bee, and they'll actually build those leaves inside of the hollow tubes that I talked to you about in here. So the mason bee uses mud, like a mason, for building a brick building. Leafcutter uses the leaves to create the inside, and they actually cut the holes just the right size and dimension that they need. So they're really, and then they carry, and they're very strong, powerful jaws. And if you could look close enough, you can see really strong mandibles here, very strong, powerful jaws, which they can use to cut the leaves and then bring them back. They don't cause a lot of damage to plants in general, but if you see holes in plants, you know you have leafcutter bees there. And if you're lucky, you'll get to see them carrying that leaf back to their nest, where they'll use it to create these compartments for them. These are carder bees. Some carder bees are not native. This is a European carder bee. Most bees in the bee world, the females are larger and the males are smaller. this is reverse in this world. The males are bigger. That's a male you see here, and that's a female over here at the flower here. And the male is a little bit more brightly colored than the female. And these are sort of really aggressive. And so they actually will attack other bees, and they're actually, can affect our native pollinators. So they're not exactly what we want to have around, but they are around, and there is a native carder bee as well. Carder bees, because instead of using leaves, they're going to actually shred plant material. Like if you ever have sheep and you're doing wool carders and you put it between the carders, you're straightening all the fibers on their sharp teeth. These bees actually have teeth, and they actually card the plant, and they bring that carded material back to their nest, where they use to do the same thing that the mason bees and the leafcutter bees are doing. So they nest in stems. We talked about the specialist, the squash bee. I think here you're really looking at that long tongue, and you see the nectar wells down in here. 13 species of these. This has a cool story that goes all the way back to the time of the mastodons. So the big elephants that once walked. The mastodons actually used Route 9 as their travel corridors, which later the Native Americans used those because they were well compacted, because the mastodons walked back and forth over these paths, which later became Route 9 because it was really packed down. It was a logical place for a road because it was kind of flat. So mastodons were gardeners in the old days. And squash lived here in New York in the days of the mastodon. So the mastodon are eating the ancient ancestors of squash. And they're eating these wonderful plants, which back then, according to, they were bitter. Squash doesn't become sweet till humans kind of take squash into the future. So the mastodon is like a gardener. To big feet, churning up the soil, eating the squash, going to the bathroom, fertilizing the seeds. And in those ancient squash flowers were the squash bees. The mastodon disappears from the landscape, goes extinct, and so the squash begins to go extinct as well. And it finally recedes back to like the desert southwest part of America today, and along comes Native Americans who discover the squash, and they use the gourds for storing things in, or use them for musical instruments. And they start diversifying squash again. And so you'll find most of the 13 species of squash bees are now found in the desert southwest area, Mexico part of the world. Only one species is found here. And then squash is part of the three sisters that the Native Americans grew all together. So corn grew tall, bean grew up corn, and squash grew along the ground, kind of shading the ground from weeds. So it was a symbiotic relationship. But interestingly, these three plants didn't come back to New York at the same time. Squash was the first of the three sisters to return to New York. How does plants have to acclimate over time to different environments and temperatures and things like that. How did squash get back here so fast before corn and bean? Because it had been here before. And with it came the squash bee. So anytime you have squash, a lot of times farmers will go hire honeybee hives to pollinate their flowers. So they'll pay money out of their pocket to have a honeybee farmer bring bees to pollinate their flowers. They don't have to do that, because here you have a perfectly good pollinator right here. And it's not even squash bees you'll see in squash. You'll see bumblebees, green sweat bees. You'll see the whole diversity of bees. Squash farmers, most farmers don't have to pay for somebody to bring honeybees to their farm, as long as you have habitat for them. And habitat is key. Longhorn bee, I said earlier in the thing on the bee, this is a male bee because he has long antenna. The female has short antenna, and she has these long scopi here on the back of her leg where she collects the pollen. And so she's busy collecting the pollen, and the male is drinking nectar, most likely, as he goes around the flowers. And these longhorn bees love plants in the sunflower family or the aster family. So they're specialists to plants in the aster family. So a sunflower you think of as one flower. A sunflower is actually thousands of little teeny tiny flowers. And any plant in the aster family is the same way. Digger bees, we talked about that. Does he live underground or above ground? The digger bee. Yes. That's right. He digs, right? Digger bee, or she digs. Large carpenter bee, I leave this kind of for last because this is our largest bee and the most pest to a lot of people because they love our houses and they use those strong mandibles to create holes. And this is a side profile of a large carpenter bee hole. But interestingly, they're the largest bees, and they only lay, each female only lays about 3 eggs in their lifetime. So their populations actually grow very slowly. When they emerge in the spring, say this is your home, they'll emerge in the spring. At that time, these holes are empty for a very short period of time. Not at night. They go back in these every single night. But during the day when they all leave, you can fill these with wood filler if they're a problem in your home. And then you can discourage them from living in your home. But they use these generation after generation. So let's just say we have one carpenter bee. She comes in here and creates her hole year 1. The next year, her daughters might dig an offshoot here and an offshoot here. And now you have 3 bees sharing the same hole. And that goes on as generation after generation pass. But in nature, in the wild, they would typically be living inside of old dead snags and trees out in the forest. If you go to Minnewaska State Park after the forest fires there, you see all kinds of carpenter bees, and they're living in all of these old dead trees. In a great habitat, natural habitat for them. That's their natural habitat.
What's their general radius of flight?
They got like a mile-long radius of flight, too. And so in the spring, they'll lay their eggs, and they actually hatch by July. So by July, they'll actually hatch, and around July, the females will be laying their next generation of eggs. So when they first emerge in the spring, these bees actually all overwinter, not just well, there is no queen, but not just the females, the males, everybody. They'll actually overwinter inside these holes. So they just go to sleep for the winter. So a lot of bees will hibernate as well.
You said the females do sting, though.
The females can sting. But with solitary bees, you literally got to like grab them and touch them. Like even with bumblebees, I've only ever been stung by a bumblebee because I drove my lawnmower over their nest. And that was the only time. And their stings hurt, and they can sting multiple times. Honeybees have barbed hooks, and so their stingers will rip out. Bumblebees can sting multiple times. All these other bees can sting. They don't have barbed hooks. So, but carpenter bees, and I'll watch it. I had on my porch. I used to watch the carpenter bees, and they could dig and they'll dig all night long. You see the sawdust piling up, and they can dig about the length of their body a day. So. This is one just emerging after hatching. It's a nice young-looking bee, no tattered wings, nice and shiny. Probably just emerged from the pupa stage to adult, so in about July. Then you have, so in nature, sometimes we have large things. You also have small things. A small carpenter bee, they live inside of bramble bushes. So like blackberries and raspberries. They'll nest in the hollow stems. Which interesting thing is, but is this a male or a female bee? Look at its face. What do you see on it?
Female?
Well, what is this? That's a white patch, right?
Oh, it's male.
That's right. White patch are always males. So good job. So it's a male. And I also, they don't have a lot of hair on them either, the small carpenter bees. But they will actually have multiple generations. So the first, the overwintering females will come out. They're almost like queens. So she will go inside of this stem. She'll lay eggs. That first generation will hatch. And then out comes all the females. Those females that first year when they hatch won't lay eggs. They actually help their mother through that whole season. And then they'll go back into the stem in the winter and sleep. And when they emerge the next year, then they'll lay eggs. They'll all go find their own homes. But the first year, the females, babies, will all help their mom the first year. So we're starting to see the beginning of socialization in this species of bees. And there are other small bees that do that too, where the offspring will help, and they'll have multiple generations over the year. Here's a female one. We see the pollen on her hind leg. And then I kind of end here with bumblebees, because we're all familiar with bumblebees. Bumblebees are cool because if you are getting into bees, they're probably the easiest that you can. This is actually a honeybee. I just use it as an example. But bumblebees are always fuzzy. What's cool about this bumblebee is it's on Dutchman breeches, which is one of the first flowers to bloom in the spring. bumblebees are a specialist to this plant. They're really the only pollinator that pollinates Dutchman breeches without cheating. So the reason I say that, the queens have longer tongues than our workers, so that tongue can reach the nectar all the way up in here. And she will actually vibrate her body to get pollen out. It's called buzz pollination, which is something that our native bees can do, which honeybees cannot do. So when you think of tomatoes, tomato farmers almost always use bumblebees because they can do something called buzz pollination. And I have here somewhere a tuning fork. I don't know what I did with it. You see it? Oh, cool. So this is a tuning fork. So let me just jump ahead to this. So buzz pollination. So 256 gigahertz. I'm not into music, so these numbers don't make a lot of sense to me. Middle C, which this tuning fork is a middle C. So you could take this tuning fork and do the same thing as a bumblebee by going to tomato flowers. Tomato flowers need buzz pollination. You can pass that around and hear the sound to it. Yep, it'll keep the sound. Yep, just listen to it, to your ear. You hear it? Pass it along. And you don't have to hit it again. You should be able to hear it. That is middle C. So if you took a tuning fork and put it up to this is a native plant, and it literally needs the pollen shaken out of it. So without moving her wings, she vibrates, and that pollen will be shaken out like a salt and pepper shaker. And so middle C is what the bumblebees do, and a lot of our native bees. All right? This is why our native bees are so important, because our native flowers need native bees. And honeybees often will go to like invasive plants or non-native plants, but a lot of our native plants need this special form of pollination. These are a lot of the common bumblebees that you'll see here in the Hudson Valley, but I do want to point out this is it's called the confusing bumblebee because it could be confused with the Bombus fervidus, which is a yellow bumblebee, which so happens that I found Bombus. There's a Empire State survey that recently happened, and in that survey they wanted to know the frequency of bees of different species of pollinators in New York State. Some of the outcomes of that was that the yellow bumblebee, Bombus fervidus, which I don't have a picture of here because at the time I did this, I didn't even know it was a common bumblebee. I found it up in the Catskills, but turns out the New York City area in Westchester County, there's a pretty substantial population of Bombus fervidus, the yellow bumblebee. Yeah. I found Bombus borealis in the Adirondacks, and both bee species, due to that thing, were more prevalent than previously thought. But it seems the yellow bumblebee is quite happy to be in this area. So the work that we do, planting and protecting the habitat, is really important. Because the yellow bumblebees, different bumblebees have different length tongue. There's short-tongued bumblebees and long-tongued bumblebees. The long-tongued bumblebees were the bumblebees that were kind of becoming the most endangered. And this is the Adirondacks, and this is a northern amber bumblebee, which is probably the counterpart of the yellow bumblebee that we're finding down here, and the yellow banded bumblebee. So there's a lot of bumblebees. But you see how it's kind of easy? Most of the time, this one has a red band here. This is a red-tailed bumblebee, half black bumblebee, because it's half yellow, half black. This is a yellow banded bumblebee, has a yellow band on the back. And so bumblebees are kind of easy to do, and if you take pictures of bumblebees, you can be part of a citizen science thing. It's called bumblebeewatch.org. You can take a picture, upload your bumblebee, and then you can go through the steps and try to identify it yourself, but you do your best guess, but then scientists will go on to bumblebeewatch.org and confirm your observation. I know I've talked a lot about bees, but to talk about, you ever heard cuckoo birds that go lay their eggs in other birds' nests? There's cuckoo bees. So all the bees that you see here will go lay their eggs in other bees' nests. And then there's bee mimics, and then social wasps, which we talked about. But I wanted to kind of wrap up with the threats to our pollinators. So when you leave here today, you know how to help bees. And I have some handouts here too. But one of the biggest threats to bees is pesticides and herbicides. So when you think of the perfect lawn, everybody wants a green lawn with no clover, no dandelions, And so a perfect lawn is not good habitat for bees. So we got to get away from this idea of the perfect lawn, and we got to stop spraying a neonicotinoid. A neonicotinoid is a type of insecticide that is inside of the stems of a flower. So it's in the flower's leaves, it's in the stem, it's in the root, and it's in the pollen that the bees get. What neonicotinoids do is they make the bees, it causes a neurological disorder, causing the bees to forget where they are and where they're going. So also invasive species. Invasive plants will crowd out our native plants, so it's important that we deal with our invasive species, and also pest and disease. And of course, climate change is also affecting a lot with our bees as well, because when the bees, especially our specialist bees, when they emerge, their plant that they're supposed to visit should be where they are. But sometimes their emergence doesn't coincide with the plant that they want to visit. So that can be a problem too. And some of that is side effects of that. And here I just have pesticides in application. And when we think of dandelions are a wild edible food, and it's really nutritious. And it was once a medicinal plant, and that's why it was brought to North America. It has a lot of nutritional value. And when we think of scurvy, that used to kill early people, scurvy was prevented through vitamin C, which dandelions have a lot of vitamin C. And so you could actually eat these plants in the springtime to replenish what you've been depleted in the wintertime. So, and just planting a whole variety of flowers, because we talked about them having a short radius. So plant lots of flowers. Bees love sweet-smelling flowers. Plant flowers in clumps, because even though generalist bees will visit any kind of flower, they will, if they're visiting dandelions today, that's what they'll visit today. Or if they're visiting coreopsis, they'll visit coreopsis this day. And that's really important for making sure we cross-pollinate, for cross-pollination. So bees will almost always visit the same kind of flower in a particular time period. And to everything there is a season. So making sure bees have things, because we learn about bees that only come out in the spring, some that only come out in the fall, some that come out all season. So making sure there's a continuous bloom of flowers throughout the year. And just make sure that you're providing nesting habitat. We think of like messy lawns. Remember, some of those bees nest underground. They need old snags and dead trees. And so all of these types of things become habitat for bees. Not only do they need food, they need a place to live and nest. So it's important to think about all these things when you're talking about bees and all of that. I have some resources up here if you're interested in learning more. But this is my contact. I have a card there and a website. You can go take a look at nativebeeology.org to learn a little bit more about bees.